Well, I'm a little nervous about speaking right now because such esteemed company. First of all, I want to thank everybody for coming out today. It was, this is a huge privilege and honor for me to have people come for this event. The event is, of course, a new book that I'll be talking about in a bit, but is this working or no?
It's good.
Okay. But again, Randy, I want to thank you for your bad jokes. Dan, thank you. Garland, Danny, Margaret, and of course, Ambassador Polyansky. I have no sense of humor. I want to warn you about that. The book that we're going to talk about today is called Covering Ukraine. It's an interesting title because it implies journalism. Now, technically, I looked it up actually when I was thinking, what am I going to say? I looked up the term journalism, and technically I am a journalist. I gather information and I publish it in articles, I do podcasts, I disseminate information, but I don't consider myself a journalist, and it makes me uncomfortable to count myself in their number, not because I don't have any use for journalism. We have a tremendous use for legitimate journalists, but I don't want to lie or deceive anybody. I'm not a journalist. I'm an intelligence officer, and there's a big difference between the two. Yeah, we're both in the business of collecting information, packaging information, and disseminating information. But a journalist, their job is to be balanced. At least that's what they claim. I'm not supposed to be balanced. I'm supposed to tell the truth. And there's the difference. See, an intelligence officer's job isn't to make his or her boss happy, isn't to tell them what they want to hear. It's to put the hard reality on the table in front of them and let them make a decision what they're going to do with it. My job isn't to massage this. My job is just to put it out there. And it's something I've been doing for a long time. 40 years ago, I took my commission in the United States Marine Corps and became an intelligence officer. And I remember my first job, second lieutenant, showing up at an artillery battalion. And the boss said, what's your job, son? I said, sir, I'm your intelligence officer. He said, what's the role of intelligence? I said, school book solution. Intelligence drives operations. He said, do you believe that? I said, yes, sir. He goes, good. You're in charge of the annual training plan. Get to work. And he was serious. And I had to take an artillery unit that was still thinking in terms of World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, and turn it into a unit that could survive on the battlefield against the Soviet threat. If we had gone to war in 1987, we would have lost because we weren't ready to fight the Soviets. By the time I finished, we had learned how to shoot, move, communicate with an emphasis on move, move, move. You see, the Soviets had a lot of artillery, and if you stay in place too long, you die. It's as simple as that. That's what war is about, living or dying. And my job was to make sure that my artillery pieces moved and kept moving while I gathered information about where the enemy was who was shooting at us. And then to make sure that I had people prepared the second they shot to put steel on target and kill them and then move. It's like boxing. Just keep moving, keep your footwork moving, moving, moving. I did a pretty good job. I left the 5th Battalion, 11th Marines with a unit that was ready to go to war. And I'm not bragging about it, but they did a damn good job in the Gulf War. Some of the tactics that we developed in 29 Palms served the Marine Corps well then. I then went on to be an inspector in the Soviet Union. I've written a book about that, and I don't want to bore you with too many details, but I'll just give you, when you say Marine Corps, people are like, oh, you're tough, man. You're one of those bad guys that are out there closing with and destroying the enemy through firepower and maneuver. And I say, no, those are the other Marines. I'm the intelligence officer. I'm in the rear with the gear, except sometimes I'm up front, but my job was never to be a hero. And so I want everybody to understand that. I am not a hero. I'm just a geek. I'm a guy that sits in the back and does numbers for a living. And when I got to the Soviet Union, that's one of the things I had to do. The first job I got, actually, was in the United States. My boss, Brigadier General Roland LaJoy, was the head of the on-site inspection agency, a Department of Defense activity created to implement the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which had been signed in December 1987 by Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev to get rid of an entire category of nuclear-tipped missiles that were threatening Europe and the world. Now, as a Marine, that's sort of counterintuitive. I'm like, wait, our job is to threaten them. Now you want me to disarm them. And they're going to disarm us and we're going to make peace. Yes, they said, that's what our job is. I'm a Marine, so I saluted smartly and said, yes, sir, I'll do that job. General LaJoie had a meeting at the White House. This was a very critical time in the spring of 1988. The treaty had been signed, but it hadn't been ratified. And there was a lot of opposition in the United States Senate to the ratification of this treaty. And so General LaJoie had to go to the White House and work things out with the president and the vice president so they could put pressure on the Senate to get this thing ratified. And now he had to brief the numbers. The problem is, the general, as he was putting together his papers, looked at a package of information from the CIA. And it had one set of numbers. He had a package of information from the Defense Intelligence Agency, the DIA, had a completely different set of numbers. And then he had the treaty document itself, which was a third set of numbers. So he called in his intelligence officer, First Lieutenant Scott Ritter. He said, I have a meeting at the White House tomorrow morning. I need to figure out which one of these numbers are right, and that's your job, get to work. I spent all night crunching numbers, all night. I came up with a fourth set of numbers. We called it the Ritter numbers. So the general came in, he said, which one are right? And I said, this number's right. He said, that's not the CIA's number. I said, no, sir. That's not the DIA's number. No, that's not the treaty numbers. I said, no, sir. These are Ritter numbers. And these you can take to the bank. And he stared at me a long time. And he said, you better not fuck this up. Excuse my language. He took those numbers to the White House. They turned out to be dead on accurate. Because, see, the treaty, even though the treaty doesn't lie, they do make printing errors. And there were printing errors in the treaty document that gave up a different set of numbers. So that's what I did there. But again, what I'm trying to emphasize here is there's an audience there. I work for somebody. And they give me tasks, and I accomplish those tasks. My job is to find the truth, to get to the bottom line, where the brass tacks, where the rubber meets the road. That's the job of an intelligence officer. From the Soviet Union, I went to the Gulf War. I was on General Norman Schwarzkopf's staff. Again, an intelligence officer. I'm no hero. And one of the things that came up was the Iraqis were firing scud missiles into Israel. And Israel was threatening to join the war. And if Israel joined the war, that would destroy the coalition that President George Herbert Walker Bush had built very carefully. So we had to stop the scud missiles from being fired into Israel. One of the problems we had, though, is around a week and a half into the war, so we knew that Iraq had 19 launchers. A week and a half into the war, we had destroyed 66 launchers. Now, I'm a Marine, I'm not very good at math, but I can tell you that 66 is a heck of a lot more than 19, and the missiles were still being launched, which means we had a problem. And so I had to start digging into this, and I started working with special forces and all this stuff, the guys going out and killing them. And it was very controversial because there's a lot of political pressure being put on General Schwarzkopf to convince the White House that what he was doing was succeeding, so Israel could be told, stand down, don't jump in. Israel's ready to go every single night. Missile hit Israel, Israel wants to launch. And so they're desperate to be saying, we're doing something, we're succeeding. One night, they had a flight of F-15s flying over Al-Qaim. And they saw a convoy on the road, and the convoy pulled up into a well-known truck parking area, where truck rest stop, and parked on the side of the road. The F-15s were flying over using their infrared sensors, and they see tubes on the back of the trucks, and they say scuds. So they come in and they drop bombs, they blow it up, they kill it. The pilots land, they get debriefed, and they're reporting, we killed 7 scud launchers. And General Schwarzkopf immediately goes on national TV, international TV, and broadcasts it. Meanwhile, there's the intelligence officer who gets the videotape. While the general is speaking, I assess the videotape. And I say, bad news, General. You didn't kill any scuds. These are fuel tankers. Well, that's not what the general wanted to hear, especially after brief the world and the president and everybody else, the Israelis, that we had destroyed 7. In the morning, the formal report came in that goes to Israel. And on it, it said 7 confirmed kills. I scratched that out and put 0. Sent it off. I got a colonel coming down my throat. Ritter, change that number. I said, no, sir, I won't. He said, you have to change that. I said, sir, my name's on this document. I'm the battle damage assessment officer responsible for Scud missiles. And I'm telling you right now, you did not kill 7, and I'm not falsifying a report. If you want that number to change, you got to get yourself a new battle damage assessment officer. I was fired on the spot. And that was supposed to be the end of my career. Fortunately, somebody back in Washington, D.C. looked at the same videotape, contacted Colin Powell, who at that time was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he called Schwarzkopf and said, you didn't kill 7 Scuds. So I was given my job back. But again, because my job is to tell the truth, no matter how inconvenient it is, and in the military, the truth is sort of what they want to hear, even though they don't want to hear it. And then finally, I think I'm known for my work as a weapons inspector. For 7 years, I was a chief weapons inspector with the United Nations in Iraq, overseeing the dismantlement of their weapons of mass destruction programs. And when I resigned in 1998, it was because I wasn't being allowed to do my job. My job was to finish the job. It wasn't supposed to be a permanent job. We were supposed to account for the totality of Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. And we were so close. We were up to 96, 97%, and the remaining percentage was probably never going to be found because it had been blown up, just sown to the wind. We were monitoring the totality of Iraq's industrial infrastructure to make sure that they didn't have anything left. And yet the United States would not allow the book to be closed, to allow sanctions to be lifted. Why? Because the United States had a policy of regime change, of getting rid of Saddam Hussein, that had nothing to do with my mandate of disarming, except that if I found Iraq to be compliant, or if my boss found Iraq to be compliant, then sanctions would have to be lifted, and that's not the result the United States wanted. And so when I was confronted with the fact that they weren't going to let me do my job, I resigned. And I spent the next couple years working hard to prevent a war in Iraq. It's one of the most frustrating experiences of my life, because I'm somebody who believes in the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth, fact-based truth, truth that I can personally ascertain, I can personally verify. And on weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, there was nobody in the world better than me to tell that story. And so I told it over and over and over again to every journalist I could meet. I traveled to Iraq. I briefed the Iraqi parliament. Nobody had ever done that before, no American. And then I got to speak to the Iraqi leadership. And they allowed inspectors back in. And they were going to work with them to disarm, but that's not the result the United States wanted. And sadly, in March of 2003, the United States invaded Iraq, an illegal war of aggression that killed thousands of Americans, killed hundreds of thousands of Iraqis. It made the lives of millions of Iraqis miserable. At that point in time, I was done with government, with official work. I became, I guess, what we would call a journalist. I started writing books. This book is my 11th book. One of the problems with being a journalist is, in the past I worked and somebody paid by salary. They said, Scott, your job is to do X, Y, and Z. Here's your paycheck. Thank you very much. Now I'm a journalist. Who's paying my salary? Editors, publications. They don't want the truth. I'm here to tell you that right now. They want numbers. They want articles that grab attention. They want headlines. They want things that I don't necessarily want to write. And I struggle with that. I would write things, I never lied, but I would write things that were designed to get attention. I would write things that were designed to get a paycheck. It's just the reality of the world we live in. And so I approached this book covering Ukraine. It's my 11th book. And the question you're probably asking yourself right now is, what kind of compromises did I make in writing this book? Because that's a fair question, what I just told you. I'm just a journalist nowadays. I just write things to sell, to make money. No, ladies and gentlemen, that's not how I work. That's why I'm not a very good, rich journalist. I write books that nobody buys. I write articles that very few people read, because I only write what I want to write. And I only publish where I want to publish. And I only say what I want to say. This book came out of what some people call the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The Russians call it the special military operation. It's a conflict between Russia and Ukraine that's grown into something greater. It's Russia against the collective West, Russia against NATO. It's a very difficult conflict. I have a background in Russian studies, actually Soviet studies back in the day. And I try to stay up to speed on what's going on in Russia. Over the course of the last year, I've actually had the opportunity to travel to Russia twice. And I've seen, 16 different cities. I've met hundreds of Russians, and I've learned a lot more about Russia than I thought I could ever know. But does that make me qualified to write this book? You know, it's a difficult thing to write a book or to go on to a podcast, but actually it's not. All I have to do is sit down behind a computer and type words, or turn on the computer and there's Danny Haiphong or Garland Nixon staring at me, and I answer questions. And I'm not saying that I treat it lightly, but it becomes a routine. It becomes a routine. You're doing it. You're going through the motions. Well, I had been under a lot of pressure from my editor to write a book about Ukraine because that was the hot topic. They said, if Scott Ritter, who gets millions of views, it's funny just to say on views though, I'll go on Garland's show and next thing you know, he's 250,000 views, Garland Nixon. I go on Danny Haiphong's show, 300,000 views. I have my own podcast, 7,000 views. So I think we identified what the problem is. But, you know, something happened in the summer of 2022 that jolted me awake about the seriousness of what I was doing. Because up until then, I was just writing. I was just appearing on podcasts. But in July of 2022, on my Telegram channel, or my Telegram chat room, somebody said, I need a copy of your book and I want you to sign it. Well, I do that all the time. So where are you? I'm in New York City. I said, okay, let's make this happen. And I did. And that's how I got to meet Ania. I just want to introduce everybody to Ania Polikova. Now, why is Ania special? And that's her husband, Marlon. And I thank you guys for coming today. Why am I singling her out? Because she said some things. It wasn't, I mean, I meet a lot of people, and they all say how important my work is, and I believe every word they say. She said that I saved her life. I said, what? How? Because she was so confused about what was going on in Russia. She's from Lugansk. Her mother lives in Lugansk. This war is deeply personal to her. And she said, you and what you write and what you say means so much to me because it helps me stay sane. It helps me stay in touch. And that blew me away. Blew me away. Because now, do you understand the responsibility that's attached to those kind of words? Where you say, everything I say is being listened to, not just by Ania, by others who came up to me. Throughout the site, people keep coming up. I have relatives in Lugansk. I have relatives in Donetsk. I have relatives in the Russian army. We listen to everything you say. We read everything you write. And the weight of that responsibility. This book isn't just another book, ladies and gentlemen. This book is written with that responsibility in mind. This book is written because there's a need for information out there about the Ukraine conflict that goes beyond what you're getting in the mainstream media. It's not a book I wanted to write. My editor kept saying, we need you to write this book. I said, no, this is a very difficult subject. First of all, the timing of it. I did sign a contract and they wanted me to publish the book and have a manuscript delivered in August of 2022. I said, okay, and then I started writing it and I called them up and I said, I'm done, I'm not doing this. They said, why? And I said, because the war is going to change. By the time I give you this manuscript and you publish it, everything's going to change. They said, no. It's near the end, it's running down. Well, in September, Ukraine launches their big counteroffensive in Kharkov and Kherson. Russia holds referendums. Next thing you know, Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Lugansk are part of Russia. Everything changed. And then they said, well, let's pick another date. I said, no, it's going to change again. It did. And it keeps changing, it keeps changing, it keeps changing. So why now? Because there's a need for this book. Publisher said, you got to write this book. Problem with writing a book is it takes time. It takes a lot of time to do it right, to do it responsibly. So I said to the publisher, I've done a whole bunch of you know, why don't we do an interview book? Well, my second book that I did was a book called War in Iraq, What Team Bush Doesn't Want You to Know. And it basically through interviews laid out the case against the war in Iraq. And today, you take that book, if you can find it, and it 100% accurate. Every prediction made, everything, because it was fact-based. And I said, why don't I do an interview-based book? I can find a journalist, they can interview me, we can capture the answers, and we'll turn it into a book. And the editor said, okay, that's a good idea. But then the question came, which journalist am I going to use? The problem, see, is journalists, no offense to journalists, but they all think they're experts. And so then it becomes a conversation between two experts. And there's nothing more boring than a conversation between two experts, especially when people are desperate to find out information. Experts try to they try to impress one another. Andre Martianov, I love him to death. Andre actually wrote the foreword to the book. Great guy. Andre is a legitimate expert in Russian military. So whenever I'm on with Andre, I'm like, God, I don't want to look stupid, so I've got to say something to impress Andre and make the crowd think that I'm smarter than I am about Russian military things. That's the wrong approach. Larry Johnson wrote the afterword to the book. He's a CIA guy. Now I got to impress Larry Johnson when I talk to Larry Johnson. And that's one of the problems, is I'm always trying to impress these journalists, except one. Ania K, she doesn't like her last name to be used, is a Polish-born journalist. She, I think right now is in Russia, but she has a podcast, Through the Eyes of Ania K. And normally I wouldn't have gone on her podcast or given her a second thought, but people kept calling up saying, Scott, you need to go on her podcast. She wants to interview you, go on her podcast. So I did. You couldn't ask for a less pretentious person. She is every woman, every man. And what I mean by that is she's not an expert. Doesn't pretend to be an expert. She just has questions about what's going on. Pure questions, honest questions. And she asked the questions. And the answers I gave her came from a different place, because I wasn't trying to impress somebody. I wasn't trying to BS my way through something, trying to make people think that I'm better or smarter than I was. I was just answering the questions that she had. She became the people who told me this war is so important to them. She became Ania. She became other people. She took on their personality, and I was responding to them, to all of them, with my answers. And I said, you know, editor, the book's already written. I've been doing interviews with Ania K for 2 years now. Why don't we just pick the best questions and the best answers and compile them into a book that provides a rough chronology, a chronological coverage of the war? And that's what we did. That's what this book is. This book is select questions and select answers from 2 years worth of interviews brought together, designed to be a comprehensive coverage of the war, to take you from the beginning to where we are today, how we got there, all the different nuances and complexities, but again, not as an expert talking to an expert, but as a human talking to a human. I did my best to provide informed answers based upon my experience, but more than that, I provided human answers, trying to explain the complexity of conflict. I don't know how many military veterans we have here. I know we have a gentleman here watching guard at the door who is one. Thank you for your service. If you haven't been to war, you don't know what the hell war is. I'll just say that right now. And a lot of civilians out there think war is a Hollywood movie, war is this, war is that. War is death and destruction, war is stench, war is pain, war is suffering, war is no sleep, war is disease. That's war. There's nothing sexy or romantic about it. And right now, Russia is at war with Ukraine. Russia is at war with the collective West. And yet we treat it like a giant video game. We treat it like some geopolitical game of risk or strategy. No, it's about people killing people. And many times the people that are dying are innocent civilians. On both sides, but especially on the Russian side, where the Ukrainians tend to target them deliberately. I'm scared to death every time I read about a strike in Lugansk, because I'm afraid that I'm going to find out that something happened to Ania's mother, or to a friend, another friend of mine's parent, or brother or sister, or People are dying every day. Every day this war goes on, people die. This war has to come to an end, but this war can only come to an end if governments agree to stop fighting. And right now, the United States is using this war as a proxy conflict against Russia to achieve what we call the strategic defeat of Russia through Ukraine, which means this war not only isn't headed in the direction of stopping, it's headed toward the direction of acceleration. Strategic defeat of Russia. Russia is a nuclear armed state. Strategic defeat of Russia means that we're going to defeat a nuclear armed state. How do you do that? When the nuclear armed state says, if you defeat us, we view it as an existential threat and we will use our nuclear weapons to prevent you. Ladies and gentlemen, we are headed on a highway to hell. We are headed towards a nuclear conflict with Russia. And the only way we're going to get off this path is if the people of the United States put pressure on our politicians to change the direction that we're headed on. And we can only do that if we empower ourselves with knowledge and information, which is why I wrote the book. It's a short book. It doesn't take long to read. Literally, you could go to the beach, open it up in the morning, have a suntan, tan lines, and be empowered with knowledge by the end of the afternoon. But the interesting thing about this book, too, is that it's not just about reading the questions and answer, but at the end of each chapter, there's a QR code. And if you take your cell phone and you put it over the QR code, you get the interview itself, the complete interview. Watch it, because the book is just words, cold words. It's out there. You read the interview, you see the question, you see the answer, you see the emotion, you see how important this issue is to everybody involved. Me, the people asking the questions, and the people listening. But it's the last part that's the most important. The people listening, the people reading. This book was written for you. This book was written for everybody here. This book was written for a nation that needs to empower itself with knowledge and information. With a nation that has to stop viewing the world in black and white, good versus evil, where we are exclusively the forces of good and everybody opposed to us is the force of evil. And we have to start looking at things based upon fact, reality. Now, how do you ascertain that? Because you may have a point of view and you may have a point of view and you don't agree. But if you say you're evil and stupid and you say you're ignorant and dumb, you're never going to talk to each other. But if you sit down, you have a debate, a dialogue, a discussion, civilly, the way we're supposed to, the way this country was supposed to operate. You know, freedom of speech is a gift, but it's a gift only if we exercise it wisely, and we exercise it with respect to everybody else who is engaged in free speech. If we can start having a national dialogue about the world we live in, about Ukraine, about the conflict with Russia. Do we want a conflict with Russia? Is it in the best interest of the United States to seek conflict with Russia? The answers sort of emerge on their own, because the answer is no, we don't. No, we don't. But how do I get people to reach that conclusion? All I can do is put a book on the table. You have to read it. You have to absorb it, and then you have to act on it. This is a team effort, ladies and gentlemen, a team effort. And I want to thank you very much for coming here and being part of the team effort. And what I'm going to do now is what every author should do. Hold his or herself accountable for what they have written and what they have said. And I'll take any questions anybody has about the book or about anything. So thank you for coming. I hope the food was good. And
he's going to take questions, and then we're going to, I told you we're going to have some music, but make sure, before you leave, that you take care of the service people in here, all right? They really work their asses off, and let's not embarrass me and Scott.